Making soup for dinner tonight, and I want some crusty bread to go with it. So I'm gonna make some yeasted bread because I don't have time to make a full sourdough loaf. I didn't plan ahead enough. But I have all this discard in my refrigerator, so I'm gonna show you how I kind of like modify a recipe to add discard. This is not a recipe I have written anywhere. I just know ratios in my head, so I'll kind of explain what I'm doing as I go. I'm gonna pour off this liquid that's on top. This is called hooch. It is just a byproduct of the fermentation process. I'm going to weigh this, and I'll probably use most of it here. I took 150 grams of the discard, and I'll just put this back in the refrigerator. I always like to keep at least a little bit of it on hand in case something ever happens to my active starter. I can just always feed this and it will become. Okay, so let's quickly work out the formula. For a really basic, just crusty loaf of bread, I usually do about a 70% hydration dough. And for just one basic loaf, I usually start with around 500 grams of flour for my formula. So when you're working out your calculations, you always base your amount of water, if you're thinking of hydration, based on the amount of flour that you start with. So for 500 grams of flour, I would use 350 grams of water. But I'm also adding in 150 grams of starter. My starter is half flour, half water, which means I'm adding in, just with my starter, 75 grams of flour and 75 grams of water. This means that I'm going to reduce my flour to 425 grams, so that the total amount of flour is 500 grams, and I'm going to reduce the amount of water I'm adding to 275 grams, so that the total amount of water is 350 grams. Hopefully this is making sense. I'm going to start with my water. I have water that's just barely warm. I don't want this to ferment too fast. I do have a little bit of time, and more time equals more flavor. So this is about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 32 degrees Celsius. And I'm going to add in here 275 grams of this water. Next, I'm going to add in about 1 teaspoon of instant yeast. The sourdough starter that I added in here isn't going to do a lot of work for me. 1, because I'm not giving it enough time, and 2, because this is discard. It's hungry starter. So it's not really lively. It's not going to do a lot of work for me. So I'm just going to kind of break that up with the starter and the water to kind of get that yeast dissolved. Now I need 425 grams of flour, and if I had bread flour on hand, I would use that. I would prefer that. I just don't have any right now, so I'm using unbleached all-purpose flour, or you could use plain flour depending on where you live and how it's labeled. And our last ingredient is salt. For a standard bread ratio, you usually want about 2% salt compared to the amount of flour. So we have 500 grams flour, 2% would be 10 grams. I'm going to stir all this together with a spatula first, and then I'll get in here and really get it hydrated with my hand. Once it feels like I can't really do much more with my spatula, I just come in with a clean hand. I kind of go whole open hand, just one, because it's really annoying if both of your hands are super sticky. And I go open and I just start squeezing and pinching. I'm just trying to get all of the flour hydrated. It's going to basically look like a really sticky mess after you're finished. All right, I'm done mixing. It just kind of looks like this. I'm going to use a bowl scraper to scrape as much of that dough back off my hands as I can. One of the things I like people to notice is right after you mix your dough, you should notice how there's no stretchiness to it. There's no extensibility to it. That's because gluten has not yet had any time to form. But when I come back and do my first round of stretch and fold, you'll see that time just starts developing the gluten all on its own, and it will be a very, very different texture when I come back. Cover it with a damp towel or some plastic wrap, or a shower cap works really well, and just let this hang out for like 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll do our first round of stretch and folds. It's been probably 30 minutes, so I'm going to do my first round of stretch and folds. I like to get my hand just a little bit damp. I just dip it in some water because the dough won't really stick to a damp hand. What you're going to do is you're going to come in and kind of scoop underneath the dough and stretch it up as far as it will go without tearing, and then just fold it down over itself. And see how it has stretch now? It did not have that before. That's because time is going to start developing our gluten, and these stretch and folds are also helping develop the strength of the gluten. So I'm just going to kind of go around the bowl, scooping around the edge and underneath it, and stretching it up and folding it back down over itself until it kind of holds together in more of a cohesive ball that kind of has some shape. And then I'm just going to cover it back up and leave it to sit. It's been about 30 more minutes. I'm going to do one more round, and then I'm going to go to the grocery store. So it will probably be like another hour, and I will do probably my third and final round. We'll just see how I'm feeling, how it's looking. I can already tell it's getting some air in it. It's getting a little bouncier. Grocery shopping took me way longer than expected, and it's been about 3 hours since I first mixed this dough. It's really, really full of air, really bouncy. I'm not going to do another round of stretch and folds just because I don't want to punch too much air out of this. I'm going to go ahead and shape it. If I would have been home during that whole time, I would have done a few more rounds in like that first hour and a half of rising, but I'm not going to do it right now. So I'm going to go ahead and shape it. I might not get quite as much rise because I didn't do it, and especially because I used all-purpose flour, but it's still going to be a good loaf of bread. Lightly flour my counter, and then I'm going to use this bowl scraper and just kind of gently scrape this out of my bowl, being pretty careful not to push too much gas out of it. I'm going to do what's called a letter fold, where I fold kind of each quadrant of the dough in towards itself to help start developing the shape. So I'm going to kind of get under it with my bench knife on the side closest to me. This is a very sticky dough, so I don't really want to grab it or pinch it as I'm shaping it. I just want to let it kind of like move with me. I like to use my bench knife to help it along. So I'm going to kind of stretch it out and fold it up towards the center. Then I'm going to go over to one side and sort of stretch that out and fold it in towards the center. And then I'm going to go to the other side. I always can't use the bench knife on my left side for some reason, so I'm just using my fingers. I'm not grabbing it or like squeezing it. And then same for the top. I'm just kind of guiding it out. It's just resting on my fingers, and then my thumbs are helping just to guide it, not squeezing, and folding in half. For a sticky dough like this, it's really important to touch it the right way, or it's just going to stick to you so much. To finish shaping it, I'm going to get all the flour out of my way. I don't really want a lot of flour on the counter. Gonna use my bench knife to get under it and flip it over so that the seam side is down. And now I'm just gonna quickly kind of round this up into a ball, being careful not to degas it too much. Just like, I don't have any of my proofing baskets here, so I'm just going to use a bowl, and I'm going to line it with that same towel I was using to cover it and dust that with some flour to make sure it doesn't stick. And I'm going to also dust the top of the loaf, and then I'm just going to get under it with my bench knife, flip it over, seam side up in here, and this is just going to help it hold its shape while it rises. I'm going to let this rise for just about 30 minutes while I preheat my oven with a Dutch oven inside, getting nice and hot at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 230 degrees Celsius. Okay, I know it is ready to bake because when I take a floured finger, and just kind of gently press into it, it takes a few seconds for that indentation to fill back in. And it might not even fully fill back in, but it is filling back in. I don't want it to feel like it won't fill back in at all, or like it could collapse the loaf if I press on it. That means I've gone too far. If you press in on it and it just immediately bounces back up, it needs a little more time. I have a piece of parchment paper here just because it will help me transfer it into the hot pot, and I'm just going to gently tip the dough out of the bowl, and if there's a lot of flour on top, you can kind of gently dust that off. And then I'm going to take a serrated knife, and I'm just going to do a couple quick scores across the top. This just helps it open up nicely in the oven and get a full rise because it needs room to expand. I'm carefully dropping this into the hot pot. I'm putting the lid on, and then I'm going to bake this at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 230 degrees Celsius, for about 30 minutes. Then I will take the lid off and let it finish cooking until it has the color that I like. The lid is trapping in all of the moisture for the loaf so that it gets a full rise before the crust sets. Here is the final loaf. It's still really hot. I'm going to wait a little bit to cut it, and I will show you when I do. I'm going to cut some really big slices of this so that it can really sop up all the broth from the soup. It's really good. It's not exactly like sourdough, but it has that kind of like vibe to it because of the discard. Bye.